Good morning, good people, early risers, people who appreciate wonderful music. And we are going to have wonderful instruction and music together. So it's my privilege to introduce Käthe Wright Kaufman. It was my privilege to be on the search committee. And I knew the minute she sat down at the bench that we had a wonderful person here. She is, of course, the associate for music and the liturgical arts, I would say, here, educated at Eastman, wonderful 2 years or more, perhaps, in 2 cathedrals in England, if you have not heard that, both at Peterborough and Truro, 2 wonderful places. And she's performed widely here in Atlanta. Of course, we're privileged to have her here. She's also the organist at Canon Chapel for the School of Theology. So, and those of you who have heard, and everyone I know in this crowd has heard her wonderful short essays and playing. Those are wonderful gifts to us and to the Atlanta community. Welcome, come in, please. Yes. So, and she has prepared this wonderful program, which is an anticipation, as she will probably say, of the Good Friday recital that she has. So, thank you so much. We welcome you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's a good sign that I've been asked to return after my first talk last year, so thank you for the invitation to come back. If you haven't gotten a handout already, please make sure you have that. I just want to acknowledge I got the date wrong. That's not an April Fool, that's just my mistake. Today's the 2nd, not the 1st. So as Don said, today is going to be a bit of a preview and a deep dive into a couple of the pieces that I will play on Good Friday at 6:30 p.m. before the 7 o'clock service. And hopefully having a bit of insight about these 2 pieces will either help enhance the experience for those of you that were planning on coming or entice some of you to attend in person. So that's happening Friday at 6:30 before the 7 o'clock service. In the 19th century, there was debate about the value of absolute music as opposed to programmatic music. Programmatic music is any music that conveys some sort of extra musical idea and alludes to something else. So if you think of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, they allude to spring, summer, fall, winter. If you think of opera or anything that has to do with setting text, that would count as programmatic. And that also opens the window for painting the text, using musical techniques to convey whatever the text is also saying. And then we have absolute music, which is also called formalism. The early 19th century critic E.T.A. Hoffmann described Beethoven's Fifth Symphony as purely instrumental music, which gives us access to a higher realm, as it actually goes beyond or transcends mere ordinary language to give us a sense of what is most essentially real apart from the totally mundane. 19th century Austrian music critic Eduard Hanslick also said, "Music has no subject beyond the combinations of notes we hear, for music speaks not only by means of sounds, it speaks nothing but sound." So those 2 were on the side of absolute music. Both absolute music and programmatic music have been written for the organ. On the absolute side, if you think of sonatas or symphonies or things that just sort of seem like music, even these pieces sometimes allude to other things, so maybe that line is a bit blurry. But a huge part of organ repertoire falls into the category of programmatic music. And I think pretty much all religious music would fall in that category too, automatically. So there are many pieces written for the organ called chorale preludes that allude to a specific melody and hymn text. Today we're going to look at 2 examples of these musical settings, and both of these pieces feature in my extended prelude on Good Friday, happening in 5 days. So I'm planning on talking quite a bit and also going back and forth to the organ to play through some examples. If you have your handout handy, you'll be able to follow along with some of the things I'm playing. So we're starting with the master, J.S. Bach. A lot of his music is based on Lutheran chorales, and he grew up in Lutheran training, and in his early years, he would have received training that focused very much on the idea of music as a sermon without words, in the words of Luther himself. One way to provide an exegetical reading of a chorale text was to set the traditional music, or the hymn tune, in a set of variations. This was done before Bach a lot by the likes of Johann Pachelbel, Georg Böhm, and Johann Gottfried Walther. Bach's versions of these variation sets are called chorale partitas, and today we will look at Bach's partita on the chorale O Gott, du frommer Gott, which likely dates quite young in Bach's life when he was living in Lüneburg between 1700 and 1703, where he was thought to have studied with Böhm. And just to say that this piece could realistically be played on any keyboard instrument, whether that's organ or harpsichord or clavichord, it doesn't have any strict indications to use the pedals. I will use the pedals a bit, but just to keep that in mind, it's not necessarily an organ piece only. So in front of you on the first page, you have the 8 chorale verses of the text, which were written by Johann Hirmann in 1630. And then later on in 1646, the melody that we now associate as paired with this text was published for the first time. I'm just going to play you the tune of this chorale now, and you can follow along with the melody on your handout in figure 1. I'm going to play the top melody, which is the one that's in the dark notes rather than the whole notes and half notes. And if you just notice that the first half of the tune does repeat, which means that in the variation sets, the first half will tend to repeat as well. So here's the tune. That is the tune to keep in mind. This tune will be hidden inside of Bach's settings that I'm about to play. Bach's partita has 9 total movements. And just to clarify, partita, this is a collection of partite, this piece. There are 9 movements or partitas, but people also refer to the piece as a partita. So it's a bit confusing. It's a plural and singular. I'll refer to each movement as a variation or a movement rather than a partita to keep that clear. But you'll see on your figures that it sometimes says partita 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, and that's because each individual movement is a partita. So Bach's piece has 9 total movements. The chorale has 8 verses. So you could consider the first one a theme, and the next 8 the variations, and perhaps each of those 8 correspond to the 8 verses of text. I'm going to single out a few of those verses to show how Bach uses musical techniques to paint the meanings of the text. And just keeping in mind this is all subjective, and you might hear something different and you might hear something else jump out to you, and that is the wonderful power of music. So first I would like to play the first movement, which you could consider the theme, and this is that same tune you just heard but harmonized by Bach. And I'm going to play this on a very grand, big registration because this is sort of the first time you're hearing it. So, the first verse I want to look at is verse 3. And for those of us at home that don't have this handy handout, I'll just read that out loud for you. Verse 3 says, "Help me so that I may always say what I can stand by. Let no useless word come from my mouth, and when in my office I should and must speak, then give my words force and weight without causing vexation." So some key words that stand out to me, force and weight, I think are quite important. And going on to verse 4, "If there is danger, then let me not despair. Give me heroic courage. Help me to bear my cross. Grant that I may overcome my enemies with gentleness, and if I need counsel, may I find good counsel." So there's some disagreement in the various writings that I used for this talk about which verse corresponds to which movement. You would think that if the first verse is the theme, then it should follow cleanly. The second movement should go with verse 1, the third with verse 2, and so on. But there's some disagreement about that, so I'm going to sort of leave this up to you. Because the scholarly commentary varies, some say that movement 4 might correspond to verse 3, which is the one that speaks of weight and force. Others say it makes more sense to correspond with verse 4, which speaks of danger. I think both are possible. On the one hand, if Bach is illustrating verse 3, there are heavy, forceful notes in the left hand that I'll be playing, and I've registered it on the organ to really give a sense of weight. I've used a 16-foot stop, which is an octave lower than the default, so that'll feel especially heavy. On the other hand, if Bach is illustrating verse 4, the tempo is fairly quick, and that could perhaps indicate the sense of danger that is alluded to in the first line of the verse. So I will play that variation for you now. Remember that each movement that you hear is a setting of that chorale hymn tune that you just heard. You can follow along in figure number 2, and I highlighted a bit of the beginning of that chorale theme to help you find it in case it's a little muddled with all the other notes. So up to you, see if it goes with verse 3 or 4. So it would have been a well-known melody, just like many of our hymn tunes today. We sort of just know and we associate it with certain texts. I think it would have been like that. It wasn't something it was out there already. Yeah. Okay, so here is movement number 4, which might go with verse 3 or verse 4. So I'll leave that up to you. I'm not sure if that goes with 3 or 4, but I could see both working. Now, let's look over to verse 7. "At my end, let me depart, relying on Christ's death. Take my soul to you, to your joys in heaven. Bestow a little space on my body, a grave by my parents, so that it may have peace by their side." So this verse, death, joys in heaven, peace. Those are the keys that pop out to me. So this one is about Christ's death, and as you will hear, the music has a lot of chromaticism, which is typical in a piece from the Baroque period in the style of a lament. And it makes it very harmonically rich. Before I play it through, take a look at figure number 3, which has this variation in full. Again, I've highlighted the notes of the chorale tune in yellow. But you can see that there is a lot of musical embellishment that happens between the key notes of that tune. This chromaticism helps create a feeling of yearning or even sadness. So I think it's safe to say Bach definitely had Heermann's verse 7 in mind when he wrote this partita, which is movement 8. If you can't tell, that's probably one of my favorites to play. It's just so beautiful. And I've used, will have heard the Celeste sounds, which I've explained in previous videos. The stops are purposely tuned just slightly off from in tune to create extra vibrations, and that gives it a sort of shimmery timbre. Finally, I want to look at the final movement of the piece, which seems to set the final verse of the hymn text, verse 8. On that day when you will awaken the dead, then stretch out your hand to my grave. Let me hear your voice and awaken my body and lead it beautiful and transformed to the multitude of your chosen people. If we just focus on that text, we see that the verse's theme is transformation. The speaker is probably addressing Christ, saying that at his second coming, he will raise the speaker out of his grave, awaken and transform the speaker's body. And this is also likely a reference to how Christ's own body is transformed in those 3 days after his death on Good Friday. So how does Bach use his music to paint this transformation? Well, first of all, the ninth movement is by far the longest in the set. It's about 3.5 minutes. That one was probably 1.5. And it utilizes several techniques. If you look at figure 4 on your handout, you'll notice a few things. Firstly, I highlighted the beginning of the chorale tune again, since it is a bit more hidden than in other variations. In this one, it is spread out a bit, and it isn't always in the highest note being played, which is what our ears tend to be drawn to. Second, if you look right at the top next to the Roman numeral 9, you'll see a two clave in parentheses, which refers to for 2 keyboards. So this means that Bach, one of the few things Bach actually indicated in his score when it came to how to play this music, he intended that two different manuals or keyboards of the organ be used instead of playing everything all on the same sound all of the time. And if you look in that bit of the score, you can see F's for forte, which means loud, and P's for piano, which means soft, all over the place. And that actually indicates when I change manuals. So he's making a sort of echo effect. Practically speaking, this means I really need to focus because my hands are jumping all over the place. You'll also hear that once I start to play this variation, the mood is extremely upbeat, very different from the ponderous music we just heard. And it's very triumphant, which probably reflects the joy of the hymn writer's words. Later on in this movement, we get a couple tempo changes, which is something we also haven't had thus far in the piece. So first, Bach writes in andante, which usually indicates a walking pace, and in this context means to slow down. This lasts for about 9 measures before Bach writes in another tempo change, this time to presto, which is much faster. And you can see this change in figure 5 of your handout. The speed change makes the music quite frenetic, but in a joyful way. And you'll also hear fast scales and dotted rhythms and triplets, and there's a lot going on. And I believe this transformation of tempo relates to the transformation and resurrection mentioned in that 8th verse. I'll now play the entirety of this final movement for you. Just a reminder of what to listen for. First of all, always listen for the chorale tune. Da, 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 da. That one. Listen for the echo effect. Listen for the change to andante when it slows down. And then listen for the change to presto. Hope you enjoy. Figure 4 and 5 are both the final movement. So figure 4 is the start. So I'm going to play, and there's stuff in between those figures that you don't have that I'll play as well. So that is just a taste of how Bach sets some of this text. If you want to hear the whole thing, please do come on Friday at 6:30 p.m. Now we're going to totally switch gears. Oh, sorry, I wrote something else here. Not only does Bach set a powerful text which stands on its own, but he is creative and innovative with how he takes the exact same musical source and sets it differently over and over and keeps doing different things with it without it getting boring. So there you go. Now I want to switch gears and jump forward around 2 centuries to a completely different style of programmatic music, which will also feature on my prelude on Good Friday. And this is a setting of Stabat Mater by Jean Demuseux. Some of you might remember that 2 years ago in Holy Week 2021, shortly before I arrived at Glen, the musicians here presented Giovanni Pergolesi's setting of Stabat Mater, which features 2 soloists, an alto and a soprano. Pergolesi wrote this in 1736 as he lay dying, so it's quite a somber piece. This setting is completely different, but it takes inspiration from the same theme, which is about Mary grieving the loss of her son Jesus. A translation of the beginning of that extensive Latin text begins, "At the cross her station keeping stood the mournful mother weeping, close to Jesus to the last." So clearly this text is very emotional. It details the sorrow and the pain felt by Christ's mother, who witnessed not only the death of the Savior of the world, but also of her dearly beloved son. Jean Demuseux was one of the most talented organists to ever live. Her dates are 1921 to 1968. Unfortunately, she died quite young at age 47 from throat cancer. But she had amazing technical prowess and lots of artistic flair as well. She was the first female organist to ever sign a recording contract, and she was also championed by the hugely talented organist and composer Marcel Dupré. Demuseux not only toured extensively and performed, but she also composed. Most of her compositions are fiendishly difficult. Thankfully for me, she also wrote more simple pieces, and this setting of the Stabat Mater comes from a collection of her 12 chorale preludes, all of which are based on Gregorian chant themes. The final figure on your handout is the beginning of the Stabat Mater chant. It is written in Gregorian chant notation rather than modern music notation, so I'll just sing the first verse for you so you get a sense of how this chant goes, and after that it's quite repetitive. Stabat Mater dolorosa, juxta crucem lacrimosa, dum pendebat filius. So that is the melody that you will hear referenced in Demuseux's piece. It starts in the left hand, and you'll hear a very strident reed timbre, and I'm using our trumpet stop on the positive of the organ. Later on in the piece, you'll hear the tune in the right hand in a clarinet sound, and then it'll go back down to the trumpet, and then there's one final iteration where it's a more neutral sound. And just to say that in the 20th century now, especially in France, it was much more common to dictate what stops were used, whereas Bach leaves a lot of that up to the performer. Demuseux says, I want the trumpet here, I want the clarinet here, this is what to use. So this is not my decision, the sounds you'll hear. When you listen for the tune, which you will hear around 4, kind of 5 times, it starts do, do, do. So whenever you hear that 1, 2, 3, that's probably the beginning of the tune, if you want to listen out for that. Demuseux's harmonic language is already worlds different away from Bach's, but this piece is exceptionally harmonically crunchy, and I think that has to do with Demuseux painting the fraught atmosphere at Golgotha directly after her son's crucifixion. Harmonies aside, much of the music surrounding this main chant themes happens on the offbeat, which lends itself to a sense of instability. But I wonder if this also might be Demuseux depicting the dropping of Mary's tears slowly. So there's a lot of imagery to think about, and probably a lot more that might occur to you in the moment as you listen. So I will play through this piece now and hope it evokes some interesting imagery for you. not the cheeriest piece in the world, but not the cheeriest subject. So that is a taste of two wildly different types of programmatic music. The other pieces I'm playing on Friday, I think they all count as programmatic. There is Bach's famous chorale O Mensch bewein, which is just beautiful, O man, bewail your sins. And I'm also playing a piece by the British composer Andrew Carter called Lacrimae, which was written after the death of John Scott. Lacrimae also means tears falling, so it sort of has double significance for me as an organist. So I hope that's useful and interesting to you. I'd love to take questions. I think we have a mic that will come down at some point. Yes, the composer of this is Jean Demessieux, Demessieux. And it's a woman. Jean is sometimes a man, but this was written, I don't know that for sure. I should know that. I'll have to get back to you. Oh well, it's during the mid 20th century, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know the exact year, but yes, very French. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? We have a microphone here, if that's. Oh, absolutely, yeah. So, no, yeah. Well, first of all, it's slow. I have time to think about where I'm going and all that. But no, she's really written just crazy. I mean, I think it would take me a good solid 2 years to play some of the other etudes she wrote. And if you think of Chopin's etudes, there's some pretty tricky ones. I think it's sort of, but he also wrote easier preludes, that kind of thing.
That you are so knowledgeable and such a wonderful speaker, and it just enhances. I was a musicology major.
Oh, great.
Yeah, 100 years ago, but when dinosaurs still walked the earth. But I am so impressed with the way you've explained what's going on in the music. I mean, I understand themes and variations, but when you've just done a beautiful job, and I just wanted to
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I do have a question about you said was it the Celeste that you said is intentionally a bit out of tune?
Yes.
How does that work? I mean, is it out of tune enough to hear the beats?
Yeah, so I'll take the mic with me as I talk through this. So on the Récit, we have the Voix Céleste, which traditionally goes with the viol de gamme. So here's the viol de gamme on its own. I'll just play C major chord. Here's the same chord in the Celeste. It's a bit sharper, so if I put them together, and we have the same thing in the Positif. There's the Dulcian on its own, which is sort of the normal one. And then the Unda Maris is tuned a little flat. Put them together. It's very ethereal, beautiful sound. So in that variation of the Bach, I had both of those celestes engaged. So you had the normal tuning, you had slightly under, and you had slightly sharper. So there was a lot of beats happening. Yeah.
So it sort of thickens the sound a little bit.
It does. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all you do, and I really enjoy your YouTube videos. Also, those are really excellent.
Oh, glad you like them.
I was wondering about the relationship. If you could say a little bit more about the relationship between Bach and Hermann, like were they contemporary? Hermann and Bach.
Oh, Hermann, yeah.
And then also, I was wondering who wrote the text for this. Is it the text that was actually the words, the lyrics?
The translation or the
original, was that some traditional?
That's Hermann wrote the text.
Okay, so he,
yeah.
And were they contemporaries? Were they?
I think he was maybe 50 years before, yeah.
Okay, so
before
they
Bach.
weren't.
So it's probably not too far off from a hymn text you would have in our hymnals, and whoever wrote that I think that would be the sort of relationship probably.
Okay.
I don't think they knew each other, but I don't know for certain.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. I opt for Mary's Tears. The disconcerting offbeat, and did I hear a canon
Yes.
at the sixth or the fifth?
Let me tell you exactly what interval it's at. Yes, there is a canon when the clarinet comes in.
Yeah.
It's at the sixth. Yeah, that's right. So Don is talking about this part. You have that first iteration, and then the second voice comes in on top of that. So it's that Stabat Mater tune on top of itself, and that adds another layer, I think.
Yeah. And he's always doing that. Not always, but I mean in Bach. So you're another structural connection.
Yes, that's
I think
right.
that you're pointing out. And of course, French music, you can't help but hear Messiaen in the background.
Yes.
With those chords.
Absolutely.
But
and Demiseux played a lot of Messiaen. She was going to record the entire works of his on CD before her unfortunate, untimely death. So if only we had that in the historical record, that would be amazing.
I guess what I want to say then is this sonic depiction of grief that we get obviously in both composers and many other composers too.
Yeah.
But there's something about the hesitancy. We aren't quite sure of what we're feeling, but we are grieving deeply, and that comes through so beautifully in this excerpt of it. Anyway, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it seems to me that we need somebody like you to kind of help us understand what's really going on in the music. You know what I mean? To understand all the subtleties, things that Don was just talking about.
Yeah.
In Bach's day, who was appreciating this at this level? Was he doing this for other composers who might be musically literate that way?
Well, I think society has changed since Bach's time, and I think everyone who attended the church would know those tunes, maybe sing them by heart, you know, and know them a bit more viscerally than the average congregation member today might, you know. So chances are they would hear, oh yeah, oh he's being very clever there, or something like that. But I think also, you know, the people playing it will always appreciate it. As an organist, I sometimes worry that a lot of the Bach I play is so fulfilling for me to play, but maybe not as fulfilling for my audience to listen to. Ideally, it is fulfilling, but sometimes I worry with these long a la breve fugues, you know, for example. So I think, and he may have been writing it, it might have been his own act of worship to compose it as well, so it's for him in that way too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, we have time, I think.
Take it away from anyone else. In figure 3, in Partita 8,
Yes.
there are, if you trace the harmonies, there are very remote keys that are produced.
Yes.
And would you say a word about that? I mean, in some sense, the descending chromaticism was a cliche
Right.
of that. But what he does with it is just astonishes me. Even though I knew it was coming.
Yeah, so especially the fourth full bar of this, the second line, first bar, especially there, it's like you get whiplash almost. But also another thing to consider is the tuning system of that day would not have been equal temperament, which means that some keys sound much better than others, and the crunch would be exceptional. Anything like in G flat major, F sharp major, for example, would just sound wrong and out of tune. And so he's knowingly creating those almost painful harmonies when he uses chromaticism.
That's what you meant by the expression crushy?
Crunchy, yeah.
Crunchy harmonies, yes.
Something that makes you go, ugh.
That's a new musical term for me, so thank you for that.
Yes.
Crunchy.
That's right. I think, well, Bach, he wrote the Well-Tempered Clavier, so it was tending that way, but he would have had access to historical instruments that still had tuning in mean tone or quarter comma or whatever.
Yeah. So there would have been a significant difference when he was playing these on the organ.
Potentially.
It would have been much more jarring than what we hear.
Yes, or harpsichord or anything like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But people were used to it.
Yeah, but also, organists avoided the problematic key areas, and it was tuned in a way that because those keys weren't used as frequently, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, pretty daring.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely proving his point. And the other variations are great too. I mean, there were 4 or 5 that I didn't play for you, so the ones I chose are the ones that I think have the most obvious text painting going on, but.
So, sorry, thank you again. And I was wondering, what would the organ have been like for him? Was it sort of a, what provided the wind, and also sort of like, was that a new invention at that time, or
Was that what at that time?
Was it a new invention at that time, or had it been?
So probably at Bach's time, the organ, the bellows would still have to be manually pumped, I think, which means, well, we had an example of this in Rochester where you sort of go in the back room and you have the big blower, and there was a switch you could turn on to cheat, and that would get the blower going using an engine, which is the way the motor powers this one, providing the air. But you could also switch it off and do it the old way, which is where you'd have 1 or 2 people. You are on an elevated box, and you step onto each pump, and as you slowly take off your weight so as not to shake the wind, it slowly goes up as it pushes air through, and then you just have to constantly keep an eye on it and push it down when needed. And I think there are anecdotes that choristers, choir boys that misbehaved had to go pump the organ. It's a good workout. I've done it. So yeah, back then, and actually, back at Eastman, we had a Bach-style recreation organ, which is really fantastic. And again, there was a way to use the motor, the modern help and aid to getting the wind going, or you could recruit some of your colleagues to come pump. And actually, I think having it the old way made it sound more alive in a way. The wind is more, it's not just constant, it's variable, and sometimes it means it might shake and it sounds a little strange, but it's sort of more of a living, breathing thing, which is valuable, especially when playing the music of that time.
And had organs like that been around for a while at Bach's time, or was that?
They were around. He was sort of in a golden age of that North German and Central German organ building, but they were already around and continue to be around. It's just amazing when I took a friend up into this organ the other day to show her all the pipes and things, and I said, the way they built it's pretty much the same to how they did 300 years ago, and they last, it's really amazing feat of engineering. Yes, he would. They wouldn't have been the same. But yeah, the question was if Bach would have had access to the different variety of timbres and sounds, and he would have had not exactly the same. This organ is quite French. It has a very French accent. But he would have had similar things like mixtures and maybe even Celeste under a different name, things like that. So there are always going to be special effects and different sounds on organs. Oh yeah, our choir members are.
Are you being paged?
Well, thank you so much for all your attention, and I really appreciate getting to chat about what I do. Sometimes it feels like I have a lot to say about things but don't get to, and I just write my little paragraph in the bulletin, so it's great to be able to sort of flesh things out for you all. I'd love to, yes. On campus or on 2 here, then, and Schwartz? Yeah? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, this might be a political question. I don't know. No, yeah, this one, the one here in the sanctuary, it's the one I play the most often, the most frequently. I don't actually get to go to Schwartz that often, so we're going to eliminate that from the options. But it's big. It has lots of options for different sounds and combinations, and so the possibilities seem endless. The little chapel is beautiful. It's temperamental and limited sounds, so certain things work very well on it. Certain things it's a bit of a stretch to make it work. This one, I think, is a bit more eclectic in that it can play most anything. So that's very rewarding, yeah. Well, I think Bach works on any organ ever, even a Hammond, yeah. Yes. But yeah, I think with this one, it's characterful enough that you can make anything work. Thank you.
Thank you. This, for those of you who are online, you didn't get a chance to feel the sense. Maybe you did, anyway. But so we are deeply grateful to you. And we always end this class with a prayer. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, your gift of music is beyond our telling. So we hear it and rejoice. We give you thanks for the talent of all musicians, and especially for Käthe this morning. And we ask that your music, that the music of Bach and all who follow Bach, be heard as healing in this world, to calm our grieving and strengthen our rejoicing. This we ask in the name of Jesus, who is our song and our music. Amen.